I've been with you guys, some of you, when I first got here 19 years ago. I say that to say that been through a lot of things with a lot of you. Officiated some of your children's weddings, baptized a bunch of your kids, officiated funerals for your parents. You know, 19 years is a long time. The average stay at a church for a pastor in America is 2.5 years. You don't really get to know people in 2.5 years, but that's just the way the system kind of works. I could tell you why the system works that way too, before you smile. You might think it's these pastors that don't want to stay. It's called the Laodicean church. Laodicea means people ruling, and when people rule and God doesn't rule, that happens a lot. Thankfully, we're not too Laodicean. It's very safe, I obviously know that I have a prophetic edge to my tongue. I don't necessarily want to. I always envy those pastors, those happy, nice guys that they're able to just say, this is the day the Lord has made, and they're able to smile, and I don't necessarily think they're doing anything wrong. But, people have different mantles, and they have different callings. And I used to speak very prophetically about the end days and speak prophetically to people. It comes from, I'd like to think it comes from God. It makes no sense. It just pops out. Like this morning, a friend of mine was on the phone. He says, I met this guy, and I said, he's from the Philippines. He goes, how do you know? I don't know. It just pops in my head. If you know, if you can tap into God, if you could tap in and get a word of knowledge, it will be impossible for you not to become arrogant. If you could tap into the heavenlies and get something from God, like a word of knowledge, there's no way you could prevent from being arrogant. But when it pops into you, you know you had nothing to do with it. And it happens all the time. It happens all the time. I'm thinking about a story right now. My mom came to visit once, and the kids were playing this name game where you think of an animal, and you ask 10 questions. Is it amphibious? Is it a herbivore? And then at the end of the 10 questions, you get to answer. And my mother says, I want to play. And she goes, I'm thinking of an animal. And I go, an aardvark. And she goes, how the heck did you know that? It pops in the head. I won't go, okay, Lord, tell me what this is. I'll never do that with a person, except if I have to discern a situation. But it just pops in, which makes me feel kind of like sometimes a ventriloquist dummy, which is, it's okay by me. But when I get a prophetic word sometimes, I'm very scared, because if it's not of God, I have so much that I got to answer for. So I've been struggling for days. I'm struggling so much that I'm physically sick. I just got sick, really sick, which is very rare. In 19 years, I haven't been out one day sick. Except for aneurysms, but not, colds and things like this. I don't get those for whatever reason. So I was struggling. I was struggling all night. I was up all night. I was struggling this morning. And I keep saying to God, how do I know? Like, I don't want to say it. And so 2 things happened. I'll tell you real quick. Just a guy came up to me and gave me a word. He didn't know what it was confirming, but it confirmed something to me. Like major league. And then, I don't wear my tallit except maybe for Torah, and God said, get your tallit because I'm going to cover you. So I want to submit to you honestly and openly, as honest and as open as I could be, which is totally honest, that if I say something and you are pretty convinced that it's not of God, please forgive me. If it's not like of the Bible at all, please tell me. If I have to repent, I have no problem whatsoever with that. None whatsoever. So we're not going to play it too safe today, okay? If that's all right. And if anything offends you or something and you need to just get up and walk out, it's okay. You're not going to offend me. I'm trying my best. That's all I can do. I told you I was going to give somewhat of a State of the Union address. Just so you know, that goes back in our country to the Constitution, from the very beginning. In the history of the world, there have only been two nations that were established by God to be a light to the other nations. One, of course, was Israel. We know this because the Bible tells us that, right? Places like Isaiah 49:6, Israel is called to be a light to the nations. They were actually at the crossroads of all the trade routes. You wonder, why did God pick that nation? Why did he carve out that little section? That's where everybody in the ancient days went through. And they would see the way Israel conducted themselves. Like, I don't know, when people develop land, they have a model home, right? They make it as pretty and as nice as possible to make you see what your home could look like. They were supposed to showcase a people of God, what other people in the world God wanted from them. The other nation was America. Israel and America were the only two nations in the history of the world that were established by God to be a light to the nations. Not only was Israel to showcase God's righteousness to the nations, but God would use Israel to birth his righteousness to the nations in the person of Messiah Yeshua, the one and only true righteous servant. Okay, no matter how many times the rabbis tried to convince you that Isaiah 53 is about Israel, it could not be about Israel. She could not be called God's righteous servant. In many ways, she was adulterous, and that's why she went into exile twice. You don't send a righteous servant into exile. America was also birthed by God, make no mistake, to separate herself and showcase God's righteousness by reflecting the light of Messiah to all the nations as well. You know that America sent missionaries all over the world, right? They were a major player in the Great Awakenings. Both Israel and America were called to be remnant nations. Hear me. Remnant nations. And in many ways, America was founded to be Israel's Western Wall. Because Israel and America were so blessed to be in such favored position with God, they would also be responsible to be obedient to his commands as well. You can't ask for the rights without accepting the responsibilities. It's totally inappropriate. The book of Deuteronomy is the fifth and final book of the Torah. The book of Deuteronomy has been sadly neglected in many quarters, perhaps due to the somewhat inappropriate title translated into English from the Septuagint. They translate it as second law, and it has given most believers the false idea that the book is merely a recapitulation of material already presented in Exodus through Numbers. God never, ever repeats just to repeat. There is always a different emphasis or new details he wants to show. Deuteronomy is a restatement, not merely a repetition of the law for the new generation. It's a repetition of the law in the sense that this new generation that had risen during the wilderness journey did not know the ways of God. So they were about to enter the promised land, and in order to enjoy God's blessings in the promised land, they must know the law and obey it. As the book of Deuteronomy opens, we find the children of Israel encamped on the plains of Moab. The journey from Sinai by way of, and it's Mount Seir, not Seir, as a lot of people pronounce it. Is that important? I think you should pronounce things correctly. Seir to Kadesh, and it's not Barnea, it's Barnea. Barnea in the Hebrew. On the threshold of Canaan required 11 days. From Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea to the threshold of the promised land, 11 days. It is now 38 years later. And the Israelites were finally ready to enter into the promised land. It is here that the Lord recapitulates their highlights and their lowlights of their journey. He points out where they did well and where they didn't do so well. As the children of Israel were on the plains of Moab ready to enter into the promised land, they pause and they listen to Moses, who delivers a soul-stirring speech, which is found in Deuteronomy chapter 28. God, through Moses, tells the children of Israel he wants to prosper them. So beautiful. He wants to prosper them, he wants to protect them, and he wants to bless them with peace. He wants them to be at peace. Basically, God is saying, I want to bless you, my children. Just like any good parent here who has children, you want to bless them. That's because you're made in God's image, and not only are you made in God's image, but being a child of God, you want to be a blesser as well. Yeshua says, which one of you, if your children asked you for a piece of bread, would give them a stone? Or if he asked for a piece of fish, would he give him a scorpion? And then he says, and you are basically evil, which means nobody's 100% sin-free. How much more would your Father of lights give if you asked for it? God is a blesser. In the Bible, when God first created man, the very next sentence after that creation, he blessed them. The very last thing Yeshua did when he called his disciples over prior to his ascension was he laid hands on them and blessed them in Luke 24. And the very last verse of the Bible ends on a note of blessing, Revelation 22:21. There's just one minor detail that God had to let the children of Israel in on. Just one little catch, if you will. Moses lets the children of Israel know that this blessing of peace and protection and prosperity will only happen if they obey his commands. Not only this, but Moses lets them know that if they don't obey their commands, not only will they not be blessed, but there will be serious ramifications or consequences for their disobedience. Now, don't get me wrong on a side note. Some might say, look, I know me. I'm not the most obedient person in the world, and I'm pretty blessed. I got news for you. Before I was born again, Satan blessed me really well. Really well. By the time I was 25, I had 3 homes. I was going to the best of parties. I had perfect health. I mean, I had no wife and no kids. How blessed was I? In other words, Moses was letting them know there will be blessings for obedience and there will be curses for disobedience. But make no mistake, guys, there is no neutrality in God's economy. You're either going towards blessing or going towards cursing. There's no neutral position, and there's no moment frozen in time. As the children of Israel were crossing the Jordan to enter the Promised Land, representatives from 6 tribes stood on its Mount Gerizim, not Gerizim, to amen the blessings. That was their position. And these are the 6 tribes that were on Mount Gerizim, and they would amen the blessings as the children of Israel would be coming in. Interestingly enough, we developed this synagogue to set that up. You come in from the east and move to the west, from the plains of Moab into Israel. Why did we do this? Because as we fasted and prayed constantly, Bernadette and I, that's what he told us to do. We never built a synagogue. I met with a guy from Israel that is world-renowned in building synagogues. His plan was phenomenal. He came here, he preached, I don't know if any of you remember. He preached, he showed us pictures of all the synagogues he designed, they were phenomenal. God said, he's a nice guy, but get rid of him. I'll tell you what I want. He didn't say get rid of him. He just said, give him a check and let him go. I said get rid of him. And then there were representatives from 6 tribes that stood on Mount Ebal. in the Hebrew. And they stood there. And they were to affirm the curses. This would be performed as the Levites spoke the blessings and the curses in the valley. Can you imagine all the Levites, the whole tribe of Levites, was speaking every blessing and every curse that was written as they were speaking. It was written in Deuteronomy 28. And they said, Amen. And they said, Amen. Every time they heard a blessing, every time they heard a curse. Can you imagine the intensity? Can you feel the intensity as the children of Israel have been enslaved for 400 years? They're finally going to their destination, and they think this is going to be wonderful. They're slave drivers. We don't see the enemy anymore. They're going into this promised land. They're going to drink from cisterns they didn't dig. They're going to eat from olives that they didn't plant. It's going to be magnificent. But then all of a sudden, they have some responsibility. A very, very intense moment, to say the least. The blessings would encompass the following. Excuse me, let me just get a little sip of water. I'm telling you, I got so sick. It's amazing I'm here. It's amazing I'm here, if you knew. The blessings would encompass the following. 1, preeminence among the nations. They were told they would be the head and not the tail. Israel would be the head, little Israel, not the tail. They would be above, not below. They would be supreme among the nations, and they would be God's segulot, his very special treasure. Make no mistake, God does love the whole world, but he has a special connection with the people of Israel. The other blessing would be material prosperity. He said you would lend and not borrow. Just for the record, are you familiar with the national debt? That's the total monies the U.S. has borrowed. Now, the U.S. was supposed to be a nation created by God, and these blessings in Deuteronomy 28 applies to them. So America was supposed to lend and never borrow. The debt, as we speak today, is $29 trillion, and that amounts to $236,000 per taxpayer. They were supposed to be fruitful, the fruit of their land, the fruit of their livestock, and the fruit of their kneading bowl. Fertility, no offense, I know some of you had to see fertility doctors, but they weren't supposed to be needed if we were obedient. Abundance of crops, the fruit of the grain basket. They were supposed to be successful in international trade, if you read Deuteronomy 28. Successful. Are you familiar with the trade deficit? If you're not, that's measured imports versus exports. So what we sell to other countries versus what we need from other countries. We didn't have much of a trade deficit back in the day. The U.S. currently has a $1 trillion trade deficit. We cannot function just on technology and healthcare. We've got to make something. And we've got to export what we make. Military prowess. Your enemy will advance on you in one way and flee before you in 7. Do we have any military people who are retired, maybe? Raise your hands. You've been in the military how long? 36 years. Mr. Mason, how long were you in the military for? Okay. When you get a chance, talk to these guys and ask them what the military was like 36 years ago versus what it's like today. I am a staunch American, but the truth will set you free. Your enemy, it said, will advance and flee. We are losing our superpower status as I speak. Okay, there was a time countries like China and Russia feared us. They're not so fearful anymore. And we'd have victory in battle. Our enemies would be defeated right before our eyes. Don't you remember Joshua had success in battle over and over and over again? But there was one time he didn't have success, remember? Against Ai, and he turned to the people and goes, where's the sin? He knew right away. He knew right away. The curses would entail the following: scarcity, barrenness, crop failure, disease, blight, pestilence, drought, madness, fear, division, calamity, powerlessness, and defeat in battle. God made sure that his children would understand that sin would have ramifications. No words are minced, no details are left to the imagination. Moses paints the picture with bold, stark realism. Israel must know what disobedience will bring so that she may learn to fear the glorious and awesome name of their God. Some 3,000 years after Moses delivered that soul-stirring message on the plains of Moab to the children of Israel, there was another group of pilgrims ready to enter their promised land, so to speak. They were a group of separatists led by a man, John Winthrop, who came to the New England, a.k.a. America, in order to worship God in spirit and in truth, as the Church of England had become a sham filled with religious perversion. Winthrop was their leader and their pastor. He, like Moses, delivered a soul-stirring sermon, and you can look it up, called A Model of Christian Charity. Winthrop reminded the believers who seceded from the corrupt Church of England of their responsibility to stay true to the God of Israel and to uphold his covenant. He referenced none other than Deuteronomy chapter 28. This rang so true to the pilgrims of the New World, as they felt as though they were following in the footsteps of the children of Israel, entering the new promised land, if you will. Winthrop warned the people that the blessings of God would be bestowed upon them if and only if they were to remain faithful to the covenant. He also let them know the clear and present danger of the curses that would ensue if they chose to transgress from the covenant. I'd like to pose a question to us. If the children of Israel entering the promised land were called to be obedient to God's covenant, and the separatists who were entering the new promised land were called to be obedient to God's covenant, then are we as 21st century American believers called to be obedient to God's covenant as well? In other words, are we the new and improved believers who are above the covenant? Or better yet, does God's covenant no longer apply to us? You won't find anywhere in the New Testament where the moral laws of God no longer apply to the 21st century believer. In fact, the prophet Jeremiah declared that under the new covenant, the Lord would write his ways on our very hearts. Because of this, I believe the blessings and the curses in many ways are still very much in force today as they were over 3,000 years ago. Maybe over the years we have been chastised or even cursed for our disobedience, and we didn't even realize it. In the Civil War alone, 700,000 people died. That's 85 years after the Constitution was signed. Just 85 years, brother killing brother. That amounts to 500 people died, were killed every single day for 4 years. Maybe one of these chastisements may have taken place on September 11th, 2001. One has to be extremely careful when they discuss these issues. I myself lost a dear friend in the terror attacks. So I don't want to seem the least bit flippant or insensitive. With that being said, we must remember that our God and the God of our fathers is sovereign. Therefore, events that take place are either promoted by him or permitted by him, but he is fully aware because the final authority is his. What happened on 9/11/2001 was from an enemy, for sure. But why? Why was it allowed? Look at Deuteronomy 28:49. Yes, Adonai will bring against you a nation from far away that will swoop down on you from the end of the earth like an eagle, a nation whose language you don't understand. 19 men came from faraway lands, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Lebanon, and Egypt, all speaking Arabic. I don't want to fudge this, but the plane took off from Logan Air Force Airport. That airport was originally Governor's Island. Do you know who lived on Governor's Island? John Winthrop. Man, it was an American Airlines flight with an eagle perched, swooping down. The planes hit the World Trade Center. They hit the Pentagon. And the third plane was supposed to hit the Capitol building. In Jeremiah chapter 9, Jeremiah is weeping. He's known as the weeping prophet because he wept in Jeremiah 9. It's a lament because Israel was going to be sent into exile. Yes, God's chosen people. This evil force of Babylon, God was sending in to pillage and rip apart Israel. Nobody wants to deal with that because they just want a loving God. Look at Jeremiah 9, 23, 24, towards the end of the chapter. Here is what Adonai says. The wise man should not boast of his wisdom. The powerful should not boast of his power. The wealthy should not boast of his wealth. Instead, let the boaster boast about this. As soon as the planes hit, God took me to this chapter. I was driving and I pulled over. And I thought, wisdom. I thought for sure we're talking about the Capitol building. And power, we're talking about the Pentagon. And wealth, he says he'll let the enemy come in and attack the city. The gate of the nation, the gate of the United States is New York. Let the boaster boast about this, that he understands and knows me. What is it to understand and know God, to know his ways, to know what makes him happy, and then to obey his ways? That I am Adonai, practicing grace, justice, and righteousness in the land. For in these things I take pleasure. Humans strive for wisdom. Those were the Greeks. They were lovers of philosophy and might, strength, and power. We love power and, of course, wealth. God delights in loving kindness and justice and righteousness. I don't think the problem is terrorism, folks. I think it's sin. And what about this dreaded COVID-19 virus? Now, I have many friends. My two best friends in Florida are surgeons. Some of my friends here are doctors. I have many, many friends that are medical professionals that are working tirelessly. My friend who runs our congregation in North Georgia, he'll watch this later. He's a doctor. He runs a hospital in Atlanta. He's so exhausted. Many of the doctors are out now with Omicron. He's exhausted. He can't think straight. And I could be very offensive towards him, and I don't want to be. This is very hard. I'm extremely proud of them, how hard they work. I myself, I'm not a medical professional, and I'm sure I'm going to get letters, but I am a man of God. And as a man of God, my job is to try to hear what the Spirit is saying. By all means, you're more than entitled to receive your own revelation. But it appears to me that this virus was used to declare an emergency pandemic that is very analogous to that of most flu viruses. You have to ask yourself why the powers that head up these elite organizations delegitimized and even prohibited effective treatments. And what about the distribution of an experimental gene serum, which is proving to be ineffective and even can cause some serious and even lethal side effects? With all that being said, why was the virus allowed in the first place? Look at Deuteronomy 28:21. Adonai will bring on you a plague that will stay with you until he has exterminated you from the land. That plague, when you look it up in the Hebrew, it is a contagion, an outbreak, or a virus. It wasn't the only one. The great influenza or the Spanish flu in 1917 took out 100 million people. You know how it was transferred? Pigs. Pigs in Kansas got it. And we were sending our boys off to fight World War I. They went there to train, and they got it and spread it all throughout the world. From pigs, it took out 100 million people. But I tell you again, our problem isn't COVID. It's sin. Moses warned the children of Israel of the blessings and curses that would ensue for obedience to God or lack thereof. Winthrop warned the separatists of the blessings and the curses for obedience and disobedience as well. I humbly stand before you, warning all of us that the judgments won't stop until we make an about-face in our country. Yeshua warned us in Matthew chapter 24 that the last days will be just like it was in the days of Noah. The days of Noah were marked by massive violence, flagrant sexual immorality, and a total apathy towards God's impending judgment. Wickedness and idolatry abounded as man had become totally depraved, corrupt, and hard-hearted. The fact is that nobody was listening then. And I'm not sure how many are listening today. The wickedness of the people in Noah's day had become so great that every imagination and thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. Look at Genesis 6:5. Adonai saw that the people on earth were very wicked, and that all the imaginings, all their thoughts of their hearts when they laid on their bed were always of evil only. In fact, the wickedness was so detestable that the Lord was sorry that he had made men on the earth. Look at Genesis 6:6, the next verse. Adonai regretted that he had made humankind on the earth. So sad. It grieved his heart. God is holy, and he has no choice but to judge sin. In the New Testament, in 2 Peter 2:5, it says, "And he did not spare the ancient world. On the contrary, he preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others." Demographers can almost estimate the population. Some say 12 million people. 12 million people, and 8 got on the ark. 8. Noah is described as a herald of righteousness. We don't know how long he was building the ark. The Bible does not tell us. It says that he was 500 and entered the ark at 600, but that doesn't mean we have a right to say it took him 100 years. But I would assume it took him many, many, many years. He didn't finish the ark after 20 and then hang around for 80. So it's probably close. He was a herald of righteousness, which means he preached the truth to the people. He told each and every one why he was building it. He warned them to turn from their sin or face God's punishment for their wickedness. But because the people were so hard-hearted and so full of pride, they totally ignored the warnings. It is obvious to me, and many others for that matter, that the world we live in today is becoming more and more corrupt, more and more violent, and generally speaking, more and more anti-God, just like it was in the days of Noah. How do I know this? Just watch the evening news. But so many of us have become so desensitized to what's going on. We hear about a shooting in a high school, 4 children, 4 parents who will never, ever make it. They will never, ever be right. And we go, there's shootings. Look at what the enemy is doing to us. The Great Reset is none other than wanting to erase God from society and laws worldwide. I am not interested in conspiracies. I'm not interested in your dreams. I'm interested in facts and interested in what God tells me. I don't watch the news, and I don't read extra biblical books. That doesn't mean you shouldn't watch the news or you shouldn't. I'm just being transparent with you. You should know who I am. I speak to you every week. Without the Bible, there is no absolute truth. We have become our own legislators, and all has become relative. We are told we must be permissive, open-minded, where liberality rules. With all this, we have allowed the laws of God and the laws of nature to be violated, legitimatizing the killing of children in the womb, even up to the very moment of birth. What about the killing of the sick and the aged? Not to mention the destruction of the natural family. For our part as the light for the world, what should our approach be to all this sin and evil? I would like to give you some very basic advice from a passage in the book of Deuteronomy. In the 22nd chapter of the book, the children of Israel were being reminded that God had separated them from all other peoples and called them to be distinct and holy. What was true and right for the children of Israel 3,000 years ago is true and right for the body of Messiah today. Let's take a look at Deuteronomy 22, 9 through 11. It says, "You are not to sow two kinds of seed between your rows of vines. If you do, both the two harvested crops and the yield from the vines must be forfeited. You are not to plow with an ox and a donkey together. You are not to wear clothing woven with two kinds of thread, wool and linen together." Do you think the average Christian kid that goes to the Christian school and goes to the nice ABC church every Sunday has any use for this? Do you think God made a mistake, or it's Old Testament, so this doesn't apply? These words of wisdom, priceless. And for some of you who have rooted yourself in Hebrew roots and you're stroked because you get to do Shabbat, I'm here to tell you from a Jew's Jew that the kingdom is not about food and drink, but about righteousness. And this is not about food and drink, but about righteousness. It's all about righteousness. Let me break this down for you real quick. Deuteronomy 22:9. "You are not to sow two kinds of seed between your rows of vines. If you do, both the two harvested crops and the yield from the vines must be forfeited." You have to give them up if this is what the children of Israel do. God was sending a message, and they knew it all too well. Sowing a vineyard with two kinds of seed is a prohibition against adding to the pure word of God, as we have to keep the word of God pure, or the results will become defiled and forfeited. This has caused a spiritual pandemic today. The call of the believer is to holiness and separation. Deuteronomy 22:10. "You are not to plow with an ox and a donkey together." Not plowing with an ox and a donkey is a warning against being unequally yoked in service. If you plow your field with an ox, which is a clean animal, and a donkey, which is an unclean animal, the work as well as the soul will get polluted. In other words, as they say today, I hear this term a lot, I'm hooked up. Kids, be careful who you're hooked up with and who you're hooked up to. Be careful where you pitch your tents, because what you are rooted in will bear that fruit. Deuteronomy 22:11. "You are not to wear clothing woven with two kinds of thread, wool and linen together." This has to be more than clothes. Ridiculous. But the Hebrew roots people, they'll jump on this and they'll see somebody with wool and linen and go, Deuteronomy 20, and they miss it every time. They miss it every time because they'd rather walk in eliticism. We know more than the church. I mean, some of these Hebrew roots people would actually go up to Billy Graham and say, "You were wrong." Do you know how pathetic that is? I'm not a wannabe Jew. I'm not a guy who has a Jewish great-great-great-great-grandfather. My whole family is devoutly Jewish. I walk to synagogue every Saturday. My mother sat behind a curtain. I said Yiska every day for 11 months, every morning for my father at 6 in the morning at the synagogue. I'm telling you, save it. Your identity could become your idolatry. This speaks against mixing righteousness and unrighteousness. We should engage the world, but not embrace the world. We should be in the world, but the world shouldn't be in us. Wool and linen, if you mix those two, they start to separate. God doesn't take his hand off us. We spread his fingers. Sin spreads his fingers. The devil can't be a home invader. We open the door. And if Deuteronomy is a little old for you, then look at 2 Corinthians 6:14-15. These are the quintessential New Testament scriptures on separation. It says, "Do not yoke yourselves together in a team with unbelievers. For how can righteousness and lawlessness be partners? What fellowship does light have with darkness? What harmony can there be between the Messiah and Belial? What does a believer have in common with an unbeliever? What does good and evil have to do with each other? To mix them is to commit treason against the Lord. Now, this is not a message going out to you guys as believers to scare you and make you think that I have so much to clean up. If there is overt sin in your life, you have to clean that up, without a doubt. But this is a message to you to tell you, don't let them make you feel weird. For too long, the church stood silent with her T-shirts and her fish on the back of the car, going to meetings and eating a Chick-fil-A. You've been insulated, Maconites. I've been to 50 states. Go with me to Portland and Seattle. Go with me to Chicago and New York. A man just gave birth yesterday. Gave birth as he was going through transgender. He hooked up with somebody, got pregnant. He was going for his final surgery. No breasts, facial hair, and gave birth. And he said, quote, I found out that I don't know if I want to go through the final surgery because the most manly thing you can do is give birth. Now, you don't see that in Macon, but you're living in a bubble. A bubble. I'm here to tell you, my friends and my congregants of Beth Yeshua, that never be ashamed of being a God-fearing patriot who loves God, family, and country. Don't allow anyone or anything to make you feel like you have to apologize for your Judeo-Christian values by which you live by. Don't let anyone make you feel inferior because you are honest at your work, because you want to protect your family and raise your children in the ways of God, because you respect the elderly, and because you want to protect life from conception. The problem we are facing today is a moral one. We must put God back in first place, and not only in our lives, but in our society as well. The only way for global tyranny to be defeated is for us to rise up and put Yeshua back on the throne of our hearts and back on the throne of our nation. I hope and pray that we experience a rebirth and a rededication so powerful that God would once again bless us and bless these United States of America. Let's stand together. Just so you know, I told you it will be 2 parts. Next week I will give you some very practical application to what I think we as believers need to do to make it very practical and very real, what we need to do in the times that lie ahead. So if you're not able to be here, which is totally understandable, please watch maybe live or watch it another time because it's going to be a continuum. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. And may the Lord lift up his very countenance upon you and give you his peace in the name of the Prince of all peace, Yeshua. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. Yo'er Adonai panav elecha v'hunecha. Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha. Shalom. I love you guys. Shabbat shalom.